Hi, welcome to Planetary Calendars, Astro Portraits. I'm Ralph Demetrius, one of the astrologers. The portrait this week is Whitney Houston. It is part of our series on musicians. Now, before I get started, let me say quickly, remember that we do these portraits every Tuesday. You can find them at Planetary Calendar Astrology on YouTube. And when you go there, if you subscribe and push that little bell, you get reminded when we put our forecasts up every Friday for the coming week. And like I said, Planetary Calendar Astrology on YouTube, and please subscribe. It's a big help to us. Now, Whitney Houston, the voice, as they say, one of the greatest voices of our times, was born on August 9th, 1963, on a Friday, at 8:55 p.m. in Newark, New Jersey, which also happens to be my hometown. She's also born in the year of the rabbit, which happens to be Lonnie and my year as well, the rabbits. She has Pisces Rising, which I'm always surprised that she has Pisces Rising because she spends so much time on stage. You would think, it would be more dramatic, but it's a very spiritual sign. This is a person who grew up in the church and grew up, first thing she sang was church music, and her mother was the music director, Sissy, and she was the music director. So she sang from when she was very young and sang at the front of the choir from when she was very young. So this is an important part of her life. She has Chiron, the wounded healer, at 13 degrees. The rising's at 8 degrees. Chiron's at 13 degrees. There's something about her experience that she was very sensitive to the wounding of others. It probably came from the fact that she was the youngest. She has two older brothers. So much of her life was probably kind of having to maneuver around all the rest of the family, with a Piscean manner, which is not that easy for a Leo. Leos want to be at the center of the attention, and here she had to instead fit herself to where people wanted her to go. She has the sun in the 6th house. It always surprises me when you have very successful people with their house, the 6th house, because it's the house of the servant. It's the house of the helper. It's the house of the person who helps you with things. It's also the house that relates to health. But you find, like, for instance, Stephen Colbert is a Taurian with his sun in the 6th house. And in truth, if you ever watch his interviews, he's tremendously good at kind of being there for the other person during his interview. He's very adaptable, and it gives a great adaptability. And part of her success came from her adaptability. She encountered a tremendous manager, producer early on, and he shaped her the way he wanted her to go, and she adapted to it, even though she came from a completely different background. She came from, the neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. Newark, along with Philadelphia, has one of the largest African-American populations of any city. It's got a very rich African-American tradition and culture and music. New Jersey is a great music state. Frank Sinatra, for instance, a lot of great musicians came out of there. She came from a musical family. Dionne Warwick is her cousin. Her mom was also a published or recorded artist as well. And she went into pop music. It was a major departure for her. I just saw a documentary for recently, and the name of the documentary was "Can I Be Me?" This is something she said to people. Can I be me so many times? Can I sing the music that's me rather than pop? But she became one of the great pop artists and tremendously wealthy because of it. She has Venus conjunct the sun. When you have people with Venus conjunct the sun, it makes them very charming. It makes them very loving. It makes them very fun and very adaptable. And she has Venus in Leo. So, that natural heart-based energy was just there with her. It's just very evident. She has the moon in Aries. Okay, moon in Aries is a powerful, powerful position because it's the birthplace. And this is where it gets real interesting. She's got the moon conjunct Jupiter. The moon's at 17 degrees Aries. Jupiter's at 19 degrees. They're in the 2nd house. The way you experience people is you first see their rising. I've talked about this before. And then you hear their voice. That's you moving from the 1st house to the 2nd house. Then you put out your hand and you touch their hand. The hands of the 3rd house. And then you have some food together. That's the 4th house. Maybe you hug. That's the 5th house. You move your way through these steps. That's how you get to meet people. As a result, whichever planet is the first in that sequence is what you tend to see first. So her first planets were the Moon and Jupiter conjunct in Aries. She was tremendously successful from when she was very young. And that's the marker for it. In fact, Taylor Swift, who's one of the youngest performers ever signed to a major label, has that same position. The Moon, I believe, Moon and Jupiter as the first rising planet. But down in the second house of what? The voice. Second house is the voice of music and money. Let's not forget the money. So this shows her coming to prominence very early. When I started looking for photos for this episode, I could find publicity photos going back many, many years to when she was, just barely beyond being a child. Very, very early on. She'd been in the limelight from very early on, which is, works because she's a Leo. Now, what's interesting when you look at the chart, other than this Jupiter and the Moon and Saturn over on the eastern side, most of the chart is on the western side. So for her, it was all about cooperation. In fact, she has the Sun and Venus in the 6th house, but in the 7th house, she has Uranus, she has Mercury, she has Pluto in the 7th house. And then in the 8th house, she has Ceres, Mars, and Vesta and Juno. And then finally, Neptune in the 9th house. Neptune in the 9th house in Scorpio really talks a great deal about her spirituality and her deep belief in spirit and in religion. You have to realize that if you ever watched her sing, she sang with her entire body. She was not a person who didn't. Her body moved. Her body expanded when she sang. Was part of her talent. It's because it goes back to when she was in the church and singing gospel. That's how you sing. It's a full body experience. And so that's how she learned. In fact, her mother said, I taught her everything she knew. She basically took sissy style and then brought it into pop music. And it worked. It worked. It made her tremendously successful. She has Saturn in the 12th house in Aquarius. It's interesting, when you look for markers in artist charts, one thing you always look at is the 12th house, and she has Saturn in Aquarius there, and it's not a packed house. Though Saturn, even though it's not Saturn's house, it's Jupiter's house, Saturn tends to like the 12th house. It tends to do well, but it's Saturn in Aquarius. It's in rulership. It's the masculine ruler or extrovert ruler of Saturn. So it's a real strong position, and it's in what you would call the Gogolon spot. It's the rising planet. What it does show is she would be very hardworking. And it wouldn't be obvious because it's retrograde, but she would be very hardworking, especially within the community. And she became responsible. All of her family worked for her. A tremendous number of people worked for her. She was responsible for a lot of people. And I think that weighed on her at times, but she just kept moving along. Why? Saturn in Aquarius in the 12th house. She really didn't know any other way to be but be responsible for the group. She also had a great talent for managing a group, and you can see that in the 8th house. In the 8th house, you have Mars in its own house. It's Scorpio house. Mars is the feminine ruler of Scorpio. Mars in his own house. So it's a very strong Mars. But in Libra, the arts. So she's very good about managing a large group of people related to the arts. Okay. She also has a talent for stirring up trouble because something bothers her, but then working on it until it's all settled, because they are the peacemakers, but a lot of times they kick the can to get everyone to wake up so they can have a fight, so they can then get everything to be the way they want it to be. If they feel things are out of balance, they will balance it. And remember, you got Mars in Libra, right, is forming a sextile to the Venus in Leo. So those two parts of her personality, the Venus side, the very social side, and then the aggressive side, are very harmonious to each other. They work really well with each other. And then in the 7th house, in terms of her partnerships, she's got Uranus, Mercury, Pluto, and then Palladina. This is really interesting because the Uranus is at the 7th house, right at the descendant. One of the things we always look for in artists is, where's Uranus? And not so much artists, but stars. The people who like, woo, like they walk into the room and all the air just disappears into them. That kind of, they just take over the space. They have I call it sizzle. They have a tremendous amount of sizzle to them. And it comes from that Uranus. She does not have it in the classic spots. She has Venus conjunct her sun. She's charming. She's beautiful. She was a model. She's got that, obviously. She stands out. She's a Leo. She's got the moon conjunct Jupiter. She's got tremendous personal drive and energy. She was a little bit like Taylor Swift. This is a hardworking kid who's really coming up. You could see that Jupiter in Aries. But she has it at the 7th house, the place where you make partners with people. Always look first at the angular planets. Whenever you're looking at a chart, see who's angular, who's at the IC, the MC, down at the base, at the top, who's at the rising, and who's at the setting. When planets are there, even if they're not in a strong sign, they're strong. They are empowered by the position. That's like that Mars in the 8th house, it's in its own house. It's empowered by that. The moon is very strong. Why? Because the moon is in the 2nd house. Taurus is the sign of the moon's exaltation. It's a very strong house for the moon. Okay? Uranus is angular. In fact, what's funny about it is that the Uranus and the Mercury are pretty much, and the Pluto are the only angular planets in the chart. They're the only ones that are near angles. All the other angles, there's no one in the neighborhood. I mean, there's Chiron, but that's not a big player. There's no one else kind of who's got leverage over it. The leverage for her was all the people she partnered with. Originally her mother, her brothers, her family, her other musicians, her producer. All these people that she partnered with, once she partnered with them, then the sizzle happened. Then the excitement happened. You never see her by herself. You almost never see a photo of her by herself unless it was a fashion photo. She's always with groups of people. She's someone who likes being part of a group. And when you have charts like this where you have big clusters of planets together, these people are always around other people. They're always around it. They're never alone. When you see the chart that's spread out and you're very isolated, those people, you find them alone a lot. But when you have planets that are real close, you don't find them alone. They like having people around. They're the youngest child. They're used to having people around them. They like having kids. They like the noise. They're used to the noise, let's put it that way. But that dynamic is really important. That's where his sizzle comes from her connections with other people. Now, we have the Jupiter and the Moon in the 2nd house. She became very, very well-to-do. From what? She came well-to-do from her personality, from her personal performance, her personal voice. The Jupiter goes back to the midheaven. It's in Sagittarius. Jupiter's sign is at the midheaven. Once again, it's that personal expression. She was not a composer. She was not a songwriter. She was a performer. And it's interesting. It's very similar in some ways to Celine Dion's chart, another chart of a person who was a performer. She was not a composer. I don't believe Whitney even played the piano. She was entirely about her voice. 2nd house, Moon and Jupiter and Aries. It became recognized early on, and that's what people focused on. And you always have to watch that for this in your own chart. What planets are at the rising? For instance, if you have a lot of unseen planets at the rising, you have Uranus rising and Pluto behind that and Neptune behind that, and the first planet you have that's visible is maybe in the 5th house, people won't recognize who you are. Because those planets, they just don't see them because you can't see them without a telescope. The first thing they'll recognize is what's over there in the 5th house. Oh, the moon's in the 5th house. Oh, okay. Or the moon's in the 4th house. Oh, they're a great cook. They don't recognize the qualities that are in those other planets because they don't see them. With her first visible planets were the moon and Jupiter. But she has Chiron in Pisces at the rising. She had a certain sense of woundedness and illusion and spirituality that was always there at the front that was not recognized. And the thing was that she was exposed to drugs, especially cannabis, from when she was very young. They were a part of her life for years, just as the church was part of her life. Remember, Pisces is the symbol of Christianity. And there's a lot of, wounding that goes on in Christianity, fire and brimstone. And this was part of her experience with it, especially in a Pentecostal or Baptist approach. But that deep spirituality, that life in the church, and also the exposure to drugs, That was part of her basic experience that was missed by people. What they saw was the Jupiter and the Moon in the second house in Aries, the personality, the voice. So it's a fascinating chart. It really is a fascinating chart. And it's interesting too, Bobby Brown, her husband, is very much described by that seventh house. Uranus, the rebel, right? Mercury, the eternal kid, right? Pluto, with a dark hidden side to him, all in Virgo, which is basically kind of the working man. He came much more from a working class background. Not that she didn't, but she came from a family of musicians. So it's very interesting. He describes it. Describes it beautifully. And the other thing too is that people's perception of her with the Moon and Jupiter will always be that she's always young. So that's the chart of Whitney Houston. Fascinating chart. One of my paisans from the same town. In fact, I used to work from when I was a young kid about 2 blocks away from where she lived, down in Newark. So remember, come see us for the portraits every Tuesday when we put them up on Planetary Calendar Astrology. And remember, when you subscribe, you'll get reminded about the forecasts, which go up every Friday. You can push that little bell, and you get reminded of those. And if you haven't gotten your calendars, you can always find those at planetarycalendar.com, because that way you'll know what's going on. Until next time, be well.